Support for NPR comes from NPR stations and Ooma, a cloud-based phone service for small and medium-sized businesses with an automated virtual receptionist, video meetings, and mobility features to run their businesses from anywhere. More at ooma.com. DuckDuckGo, a privacy company committed to making privacy online simple. Used by tens of millions, they offer private search and tracker blocking with one download. DuckDuckGo, privacy simplified. And the Zimmel Family Foundation, supporting the National Center for Learning Disabilities, which works to improve the lives of the 1 in 5 individuals with learning and attention issues. Learn more at ncld.org. Wait, don't tell me. It's a production of NPR and WBEZ Chicago in association with Urgent Haircut Productions, Doug Berman, Benevolent Overlord. Philip Goedicke writes our limericks, and our social media superstar is Emma Choi. BJ Liederman composed our theme. Our program is produced by Jennifer Mills, Miles Dernbos, Lillian King, and Nancy Sachow. Special thanks to Vinnie Thomas. Our Vinnie Thomas handler is Peter Gwynn. Technical direction from Lorna White. Our CFO is Colin Miller. Our production manager is Robert Newhouse. Our senior producer is Ian Chillag. And the executive producer of Wait Don't Tell Me is Mike Maribella Danforth. Now, panel, what will be the next big show on Netflix? Let's go to Adam Burke.
Do you like Netflix dating shows? Enjoy their true crime shows? Well, you're going to love their hit combination of both, How to Marry a Murderer.
The Great Subpoena Race. Former administration officials travel the globe trying to evade dogged congressional bounty hunter.
And Helen Hunt.
The Great Kimchi Squid-Off, where Korean
in Sandy Springs. With unique gifts, antiques, and contemporary home furnishings, Kudzu would like to thank all those that support locally owned businesses. Kudzu for the home.
The Fall Member Drive is just around the corner, and when you give early today, you'll be entered into a special drawing. It's for a $1,000 certificate to Oriental Designer Rugs to be used toward the purchase of an area rug. This drawing is only for today. Visit wabe.org/contest rules for more. Your gift helps WABE tell great stories and amplify.
For employers to fire those who refuse the COVID vaccine. The lights go out in Lebanon as the country's economic crisis deepens.
There has been no investment in this sector for the past 15 years. We have no plants to produce electricity. Demand is much higher than the capacity.
And we examine China's threat to Taiwan, that reunification is expected. That's all to come after the latest world news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Windsor Johnston. The U.S. delegation is meeting with senior members of the Taliban in Qatar this weekend. NPR's John Ruwitch reports this is the first round of high-level talks since the U.S. military withdrew its troops from Afghanistan in August.
In a statement, a State Department spokesperson listed a number of priorities for the U.S. side in the meetings. One is the continued evacuation of Americans, other foreigners, and Afghans to whom the U.S. has, quote, a special commitment. U.S. officials will also press the Taliban on its commitment not to allow terrorists to use Afghan soil to threaten the United States or its allies. After taking control of the country in August, the Taliban pledged to respect the rights of women and form an inclusive government. The State Department spokesperson said the U.S. team would be pushing the Taliban to make good there, too. John Ruwitch, NPR News, Islamabad.
The federal appeals court has temporarily reinstated a law in Texas that bans abortion at around 6 weeks of pregnancy. The ruling comes 2 days after a lower court suspended it. Elena Rivera from member station KERA reports the decision means that one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the nation is back in place, at least for now.
The ban, which prohibits abortions before many know they're pregnant, had been temporarily blocked by a district court on Wednesday on the grounds that it was unconstitutional. Then Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton filed a motion to reinstate the ban, which was granted late on Friday by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. This means the ban is back in effect until at least October 12th, even though some abortion providers started up services earlier this week. Texas providers are also looking to other cases, like the upcoming Supreme Court hearing on Mississippi's abortion legislation in December, to see what the future could be for services. I'm Elena Rivera in Dallas.
Former President Donald Trump is holding a rally in Iowa this weekend. NPR's Danielle Kurtzleben reports the move could be setting the groundwork for Trump to make another run for the presidency in 2024. Trump is speaking tonight at the Iowa State Fairgrounds in Des Moines. Several Iowa Republican politicians will also appear, including Senator Chuck Grassley and Governor Kim Reynolds. With well over 2 years to go until the 2024 Iowa caucuses, national polling shows that Republicans have further warmed to Trump in his absence from the White House. 2/3 of Republicans and Republican leaners say he should remain a major national political figure. That's up 10 points from earlier this year, according to a new poll from the Pew Research Center. And a plurality of Republicans, 44%, said they think he should run for president in 2024. The poll also showed that Democrats overwhelmingly do not want Trump to remain a major political figure. Danielle Kurtzleben, NPR News. This is NPR. Chinese President Xi Jinping is pledging to pursue reunification with Taiwan through peaceful rather than military means. In a speech in Beijing today, Xi called for peace between the two nations. His remarks come amid rising military tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan is dismissing China's remarks, saying the country's future is in the hands of its people. Lebanon is in the midst of an energy crisis after the shutdown of the country's two biggest power plants. Nada Hamzi reports the major electricity shortages are a symptom of its economic collapse.
Lebanon's power is unlikely to return until next Monday, or perhaps later, a government official told the Reuters news agency. But the state power cut is hardly felt by most of the country's residents. In some areas, the state has only been able to provide 1 hour of electricity per day. Most residents rely on private generators, which depend on diesel for their electricity needs. But even diesel is in short supply. Generators are unable to run 24/7 due to diesel shortages, leading to prolonged power cuts throughout the day. The fuel shortages and power cuts are symptoms of Lebanon's paralyzing economic collapse. The small Mediterranean country is unable to import fuel in large quantities due to lack of funds. For NPR News, I'm Nada Hamzi in Beirut.
At least 10 people were injured in a drone attack at the airport in Saudi Arabia Friday night. Officials say a second drone was intercepted this morning. So far, there's been no claim of responsibility. This is NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Vital Projects Fund, supporting the Museum of Modern Art, where Who is Queen, a new installation by Adam Pendleton, is now on view. Tickets at MoMA.org. And the listeners who support this NPR station.
Hello, welcome to News Hour from the BBC World Service. We're coming to you live from London. My name's Paul Henley. First, today has seen the first session of formal face-to-face talks between the Taliban and the US since the militant group seized power in Afghanistan in August. The discussions in Doha are part of the Taliban's campaign to gain international recognition, and with it, international aid money to save their failing economy. But they're also part of American efforts to extract some guarantees of a crackdown on international terrorists operating in Afghanistan and any advances on Afghans' women's rights. What do we know about how the talks have gone so far? Here's the BBC's Yogita Limai, who's in Doha.
Well, we've heard some time ago from Amir Khan Muttaqi, who is the acting foreign minister in the Taliban-appointed government. He is leading their delegation here in Doha. He says they want to improve relations with the international community, and during their talks with the US delegation, the Americans have offered to help providing COVID-19 vaccines and humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. He also did warn, though, that no one should interfere with the internal affairs of any country. The backdrop against which he's speaking is that it's been 3 weeks now since the Taliban banned girls from going to secondary schools in most of Afghanistan. Most women have not been allowed to go back to work yet. So that was Amir Khan Muttaqi. But what this is part of a series of efforts from the Taliban to gain international recognition. Some days ago, there was a UK delegation which met with Taliban leaders in Afghanistan. Mr. Muttaqi says they will also be meeting European officials. And the reason they want to get international recognition is because it's a key step forward in unblocking foreign funds, which have been frozen.
And are you able to get any sense of what the atmosphere between the two sides of these talks is like?
The two sides that are meeting right now are very different from the two sides that met when the deal between the US and the Taliban was signed in February 2020. So the Taliban side at that time was led by a senior Taliban leader, Mullah Baradar. On the US side, there was Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the US Special Representative to Afghanistan. This time, it's being led by two different people. So Amir Khan Muttaqi on the Taliban side, and on the US side, there are members of the State Department. We're told there are members from US Aid and also from the US Intelligence Agency.
Right, and we've repeatedly heard that recognition by the US that the Taliban has authority in Afghanistan depends on a discussion of issues like women's rights. So if the Taliban says that's interference in domestic affairs, we have stalemate, surely.
Well, exactly, and I think that's the question a lot of Afghans, and in particular Afghan women, have been asking. Those I've been speaking to in the past few days are actually say they're disappointed with the international community. They say the UK delegation that was in Afghanistan recently didn't include any women. They will be waiting to see if women have been a part of this discussion with the Taliban and whether the issues of women's rights were actually raised during the meeting. Increasingly, I think women from Afghanistan feel that the issue of women going to school, the issue of women going to work, and these are commitments that the Taliban made when they were actually signing the Doha Agreement. And therefore, a lot of the women I've been speaking to are saying, why isn't anyone holding them to account? And it is certainly something they will be watching closely during this meeting as well.
Yogita Limaya reporting. Hugo Lorenz was US ambassador to Afghanistan twice, once under the Obama administration and once at the start of President Trump's term in office. I asked him if he was optimistic about these talks.
I mean, I'm going to be positive in the sense that it's good to be talking. But on the other hand, we're in a damage control situation. Democracy has died in Afghanistan, but we retain interest in Afghanistan, and we need to work with the Taliban as best as we can, particularly with our allies, with the United Kingdom, with our NATO allies, with other stakeholders, China, Russia, to try to advance a multiplicity of interests that we have.
What leverage do you think the US has with the Taliban now? I mean, they can dangle that golden prize of recognition and international aid money, can't they?
Look, we have some leverage. We obviously don't have the leverage that we had when we had a platform, in Afghanistan, and we had an allied government in Kabul, and we were there with all of our allies. But certainly the Taliban needs resources. The economy is in free fall. 40% of Afghanistan's GDP was international aid. That's gone, 70% of the budget. So there is some leverage for us to engage on core issues. What are they? Making sure that the Taliban cooperates with us in getting our citizens, coalition citizens, out of the country, making sure that United Nations agencies are able to disperse the urgently needed humanitarian assistance. But then there are also the big kind of strategic issues. We still have immutable interests in Afghanistan relating to security. ISIS-K continues to operate in Afghanistan. You have Al-Qaeda, you have ETIM, that the Chinese are very concerned about. You have the Uzbek terrorist groups that the Russians are very concerned about. So there are core security issues that we need to discuss with the Taliban and try to get them to establish some mechanisms of cooperation and intelligence sharing. I would also mention the issue of drugs. I mean, Afghanistan remains the producer of 80% of the world's opium and heroin. And we know the Taliban, certainly from my day there, they were intimately involved. So there's some really, really big issues, and we can begin to get the ball rolling. But I don't see the U.S. recognizing, dangling recognition anytime soon. And of course, for the Biden and the Johnson governments, the issue of democracy is an element in our foreign policies. So the issue of human rights, the rights of women, and also the rights of other Afghans. The Taliban has created a completely Pashtun-centric, all-male government. And I think the United States and the United Kingdom are going to put on the table creating a more inclusive government.
There's a lot of wishful thinking going on here. When you're dealing with the Taliban, who says that you've got absolutely no right, the US, to interfere in any of its domestic matters.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, look, the Taliban is a pretty hardcore fundamentalist group. I mean, I dealt with them for a very, very long time, and they were able to win the day. They're pretty relentless. And even though it's a more sophisticated group at the leadership level, but their base is still very fundamentalist. That is not going to change because the United States and the United Kingdom are knocking on their door.
But there might be a divide between those fundamentalist supporters and the men doing the negotiations. I mean, what kind of people are the US dealing with here? They're not hard-bitten fighters from the downtrodden villages. These are men at ease in five-star hotels in the Middle East.
You're absolutely right, Paul. That's exactly the situation. The members of the political commission of the Quetta Shura, which is the leadership council of the Taliban, they are pretty sophisticated people. They've been dealing with the world for a substantial period of time, but yet they have to meet the test of their base. But the important thing, I think the lesson we learned from this disaster, the disaster meaning President Biden's strategic blunder precipitously withdrawing American forces, I think the biggest lesson of this disaster was that we didn't consult with our allies. So I'm glad to see that there's clearly a close coordination between the Biden administration and the Johnson government.
So what are the areas on which the US is prepared to compromise? If they get what they want on terrorism control, will they give on lack of women's rights?
Oh, that's a very good question, Paul. I think security is the basic issue for the United States. I mean, our strategic goal since 2001 in Afghanistan is to ensure that Afghanistan is never becomes a platform or a base for terrorist groups to strike at the US, at the UK, at our allies. But at the end of the day, we live in a political world, and in America and in the United Kingdom, this idea that we're just going to ignore the Taliban just absolutely trampling the rights of women, I mean, I think this is going to be an issue that's going to remain.
That was Ambassador Hugo Lorenz. President Biden is urging companies in the US to fire workers who haven't been vaccinated against coronavirus. He said that those worried about large-scale job losses needed to look at what he called the bigger picture. The latest official figures show only 56% of Americans have been fully vaccinated, and the president says he'll soon bring in rules to require all healthcare workers to have had the jab. He's urged states to do the same for teachers. But there's been opposition, including in the deeply libertarian region of New England, from where our North America correspondent Aleem Makboul reports.
Of course, we've seen frequent protests throughout the pandemic in the US against mask wearing and shutdowns and by anti-vax demonstrators, but it's still startling to be at this one in Concord, New Hampshire now and see some of the protesters opposed to vaccine mandates in nurses' uniforms. They say they'd rather lose their jobs than get the vaccine, and well, they might. But why? Leah Cushman is not just a nurse here, but a state politician.
My beliefs are religious. I believe that my Creator endowed me with an immune system that protects me, and if I get sick, that's an act of God.
Have you never been vaccinated against anything?
I have before I was saved by the Lord, yes.
But with that logic, you wouldn't take any medicine.
That's not true. No, I wouldn't take one that affects the immune system this way. Times 102.6.
It can be argued that even vaccinated staff have the potential to pass on the virus to patients, but Scott Colby, manager of the Upper Connecticut Valley Hospital, says unvaccinated healthcare workers getting sick also puts more strain on the resources and suspects for some there are bigger forces at play.
So it's not just COVID. There are other vaccines that employees are required to have. MMR is an example, hepatitis. So this is a highly electrified issue, if you will, and we all recognize that. To say it's not political would be disingenuous.
Mr. Colby says while much of his staff and the public have been supportive of a move he made to fire unvaccinated staff, he has received some backlash.
Save our teachers!
And the controversy swept up another profession too, with school staff being threatened with sacking if they don't get vaccinated, including in New York City, where there have been protests too.
Cobra, smiling cobra.
In Connecticut, Kasim Outlaw is spending more time at home with his young son these days. He was named Teacher of the Year at his school in 2020, but just got fired. He says he's got no regrets though.
We either have an option to become inoculated with what's called the jab or the shot or the injection of the vaccine, or opt for weekly testing in order to keep employment as a teacher in Connecticut. For me, personally, I do not use any kind of synthetic ingredients in my life, whether that be for medicinal purposes, supplementation, food and fuel. So the idea of becoming inoculated is something that goes directly against the way that I live my life and have lived for the last decade or more.
Well, what is the harm in getting tested anyway?
So when we talk about harm, I view it as an unnecessary medical procedure.
Kasim had COVID, so feels his natural immunity should be enough. But that's not being taken into consideration by a US government now ramping up its efforts to deal with a pandemic that is still claiming hundreds of lives in this country each day.
Alim Makboul reporting from New England. You're with the BBC World Service. This is NewsHour. Coming up, what the citizens of Glasgow are making of preparations for COP26. We'll hear some of their solutions to global warming.
The highest pollution right now is coming from cars commuting. The only way that could be fixed is increasing public transport, and increasing the city itself would help bring that down a lot, especially if the buses were more frequent, went to places, and were cheaper. The same with the trains as well.
The headlines: the Taliban say they've agreed with the United States to uphold their peace agreement, which includes stopping Al-Qaeda from operating in Afghanistan. A turf war between influential families in Brazil and Paraguay has escalated with the killing of 4 more people, including the daughter of a Paraguayan governor. And the Chancellor of Austria, Sebastian Kurz, says he's stepping aside to fight corruption allegations. More on that very soon. This is Paul Henley with NewsHour live from the BBC. After 2 days of voting, counting is nearly over in elections in the Czech Republic. And confounding most predictions, 2 opposition coalitions seem to have secured an overall majority in Parliament in Prague. It could spell the political end of billionaire Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. BBC's Rob Cameron joins me live from the Czech capital. Rob, it's complicated, but it does look, does it, as if the opposition could win the day?
Yes, I mean, it's very hard really to see a way forward now for Andrej Babiš, deprived of a majority, and even if he continued in a coalition, even if he created a new coalition in the next parliament, it just wouldn't have majority support. So really it's very difficult to see any way forward for him. That said, he is due to meet the president, Miloš Zeman, tomorrow on Sunday morning. And Mr. Zeman has said that he will appoint the leader of the largest party with the task of forming a new government, and by some measure that would go to Mr. Babiš. But curiously, because of the rather complicated nature of Czech politics and the PR system here, Andrej Babiš ended up with the greatest number of seats, but actually came second in the number of percentage votes. So it could get bogged down in a sort of an argument of who actually won this election. But certainly he is a prime minister without a majority, and that's the important thing.
And Mr. Babiš has been described as a populist leader. What does that mean in his case?
Certainly, yes. I mean, he's adopted an increasingly strident nationalist tone. I mean, the tone of his party's electoral campaign in the last few weeks was really quite, shocking. It showed sort of hordes of marauding millennials waving placards saying, tax the rich and tax people's flats, lower pensions, that sort of thing, refugees welcome. So really kind of appealing to people's lowest basis instincts in a sense. And obviously he has been seen alongside populist leaders like Viktor Orban in the final days before this election. So certainly he has gone down that road, I think, in an attempt really to win back voters, perhaps who have moved over to the far right, but that was not a strategy that has proved too successful for him.
And he's been on the receiving end of corruption allegations, to do partly with his wealth.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, he was the second richest man in the Czech Republic. I think he's now the fourth, maybe the sixth, according to Forbes magazine. So he was a billionaire before he entered politics, but he's been dogged by scandal ever since, really. You know, he's been prime minister for 4 years, and he's fought various accusations and allegations, and even criminal prosecutions for alleged abuse of EU funds during that time. And most recently, he was mentioned in the Pandora Papers as having invested in property on the French Riviera using shell companies in the British Virgin Islands, something he says was quite legal and that anyway happened before he entered politics. So he's always had, those accusations of sleaze and scandal following him during his time in office, and he's described those accusations as a campaign involving mostly the media and opposition figures, because he decided and tried to disrupt the corruption system in the Czech Republic, and that was the response to it. But it seems that voters don't share that view this evening in Prague.
Rob, many thanks. Rob Cameron, our correspondent in Prague. Now, Austria's political leader, Sebastian Kurz, has announced that he is stepping down as Chancellor, having been accused of corruption. He says he will take the opportunity to prove his innocence and that he wants to make space to prevent chaos. In a brief statement, Mr. Kurz said that the Foreign Minister, Alexander Schallenberg, would step in as head of government if President Alexander van der Bellen agreed.
Was es jetzt braucht, sind stabile Verhältnisse. Ich möchte daher
What's required now is stability. To resolve the impasse, I want to step aside to prevent chaos and to ensure stability. I asked the government team of the People's Party to continue its work, and as leader of the People's Party, we are the strongest party in Parliament, I have recommended to the President to task Alexander Schallenberg with leading the government.
Alexander Schallenberg als neuen Regierungschef vorgeschlagen.
Bethany Bell, who's the BBC's Vienna correspondent, has been telling me more.
He's been accused of having used taxpayers' money to pay a newspaper group to publish polls that were favourable to his party, and several other people as well in his circle have also faced these accusations. Mr. Kurz denies the accusations. He says he's going to mount a legal defence to clear his name. He said he would fight those allegations, but it was becoming clearer and clearer that his position was no longer tenable, because the junior partners in Austria's coalition government, the Greens, had withdrawn their support. The leader of the Greens had said that the accusations meant that Mr. Kurz was no longer fit for office.
Mr. Kurz is a high-profile European politician. Just explain why.
He was, a few years ago, the youngest Prime Minister, Chancellor in the world at the time. He formed his first time he was in government. He had formed a coalition with the far-right Freedom Party. That collapsed when the Freedom Party were involved in a corruption scandal. There was a vote of no confidence against Mr. Kurz and his government. After that, there were new elections, and Mr. Kurz formed a coalition with the Green Party, and now these corruption allegations have emerged against Mr. Kurz. So he's had a very dramatic career so far, and many members of his own party, I think, are hoping that he will clear his name. One minister, in fact, tweeted this evening saying that she thought he would step aside until the accusations were clear, and suggested that he might be able to return as Chancellor. Whether or not other politicians in Austria want that, or whether it will be in fact able to happen, is the big question.
How necessary do you think it is for the Chancellor to step down in order to begin a process of clearing his name?
He is stepping down mainly because of the pressure from the Green Party, his coalition partners. The thing is that he is stepping down as Chancellor. He is not stepping down as leader of the party in general. And he has also said he wants to take up his mandate in Parliament and be leader there in Parliament. Now, some opposition politicians have been tweeting that this will give him parliamentary immunity. We've also heard, though, from sources within the Conservative Party saying that he will ask for his
military immunity to be lifted so that the investigation can continue and that he can clear his name.
He says he wants to prevent chaos. How close to chaos are Austrian politics at the moment?
Well, there was a real risk until this announcement this evening that the government would collapse, and it was certainly not in the interest either of the Conservative Party or the Greens to have new elections at the moment, and it would be complicated to form a new coalition because the Conservatives and the Social Democrats and the Greens don't want to form an alliance with the far right, and that makes coalition building very complicated.
Bethany Bell with the latest from Vienna there. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Live from London, this is NewsHour.
Distribution of the BBC World Service NewsHour in the United States is made possible by American Public Media, producer and distributor of award-winning public radio content, APM, American Public Media. With support from Staples, with supplies to get business done no matter where it gets done, from ink and toner cartridges to technology like webcams and networking accessories. More at Staples stores or staples.com. Staples.
Support comes from Culture ASAP. Support Atlanta's arts and culture scene by visiting wabe.org/cultureasap with information and access to Atlanta's world-class theaters, performers, and galleries. wabe.org/cultureasap. And from Fellows Labriola, a law firm devoted exclusively to the representation of clients in complex litigation in state and federal courts. Fellows Labriola, online at FELLAB.com.
Tens of thousands of Afghans fled their country when U.S. troops left Kabul just over a month ago. Now, many of those Afghan refugees are hoping to start new lives here in the United States.
It's not just ticking a box marked resettlement. It means being part of a real community.
We'll get an update on how that resettlement is going on the next All Things Considered from NPR News. This afternoon at 5 on 90.1 WABE.
BBC News with Eileen McHugh. Following talks with the United States in Doha, the Taliban say they have agreed to maintain the peace agreement reached last year. This includes a pledge to prevent Al-Qaeda operating in their territory. Washington has stressed that the discussions are not about legitimizing the Taliban, which is seeking international recognition. The daughter of a Paraguayan state governor is among 4 people shot dead by unknown assailants near the border with Brazil. The incident is part of a turf war between wealthy Brazilian and Paraguayan families who control smuggling and drug trafficking operations in the area. The Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz has resigned. He said he was standing aside to fight corruption allegations after his partners, the Greens, withdrew support. He has denied accusations that he used taxpayers' money to bribe a newspaper group to publish polls favourable to his Austrian People's Party. The outgoing Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš has congratulated the opposition for winning the parliamentary election, but said he would still try to form a government if asked. A coalition of three centre-right and liberal parties narrowly beat Mr. Babiš's governing ALO party. 4 Congolese kidnapped aid workers have been released. They were attacked in their vehicle by unidentified gunmen on Tuesday whilst on a humanitarian mission. Thursday, 4 people were kidnapped from a truck belonging to an NGO in neighbouring North Kivu province. Lebanon is without power after the country's entire electricity grid shut down. The authorities said the outage had been caused by fuel shortages. Lebanon has struggled to buy fuel in the face of economic collapse, and there have been daily blackouts. And officials in Russia say 29 people have died so far from drinking moonshine, illicit liquor containing lethal concentrations of methanol. Cases began appearing on Thursday in 4 villages in the south of the country. BBC News.
Welcome back. Coming up next, an escalation of the war in Ethiopia as the reappointed president there ignores pleas from abroad. But first, the COP26 climate summit in a few weeks' time will involve some of the most powerful, most influential people in the world. But what will it mean to the people of the host city, Glasgow? 50 residents have been selected to be a representative sample. They've been briefed by experts about climate change and asked to come up with strategies to deal with it. Our Scotland correspondent James Shaw has been meeting some of them.
I'm on the banks of the River Clyde, looking across to the location where COP26 is going to happen. Now, the City Council held a citizens' assembly to find out what people in Glasgow thought about possible solutions to the climate crisis. One of those people who took part is with me here, Francesca Munoz. You're a student at Glasgow University. What was it like? How important did you feel it was to be taking part in that assembly?
For me, it's really special to be in this moment, in this time in which something so important is happening, and especially the fact that I got a voice on it.
What do you think are the most important things the Citizens' Assembly came up with as solutions that could be taken by the City Council?
I personally believe that one of the first things we have to do is to educate. It's useless for us to do a change right now if our younger generations are not going to know how to embrace that change and to actually make it work.
I'm in Drumchapel, a sprawling housing scheme on the northwestern edge of Glasgow. I've come to meet Robert Taylor, one of the citizens who took part in the assembly. He's 31 years old, just started a new job as a linen porter in a hotel, and he told me he was keen to take part in the assembly.
The figures show that the highest pollution right now is coming from cars commuting. The only way that could be fixed is increasing public transport, because all of that is going to be coming from people going to and from work. And increasing the city itself would help bring that down a lot, especially if the buses were more frequent, went more places, and were cheaper. The same with the trains as well.
These are issues which the leader of Glasgow City Council, Susan Aitken, has promised to deal with. She said the authority will implement the recommendations of the Assembly if it is within its powers to do so.
This is massive. What's going to be happening over the next 10 years here in Glasgow or in Manchester or in Paris or in New York or wherever is going to be the biggest change in the way that cities run. Really, the systemic change to the kind of fundamental things that underpin the day-to-day life of cities will change, and they will change dramatically. I think most of it will be for the better, but some of it will be challenging for people. So that democratic consent is absolutely essential.
Here on the north bank of the Clyde, where ships from around the world used to unload their cargoes, a cluster of temporary buildings to house events around the summit has started to appear. The world is coming back to the Clyde, and the members of Glasgow Citizens' Assembly understand more than most just how significant that is.
That was James Shaw reporting from Glasgow. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC. I'm Paul Henley. To Ethiopia now, in a conflict that's lasted nearly a year, killed an untold number of people and displaced 2 million. Government forces are ignoring foreign pleas and stepping up attacks against Tigrayan rebels. This is just days after the Ethiopian Prime Minister was sworn in for a new term. Kjetil Trunvoll has been analysing what's happening. He is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Bjørknes University College in Oslo.
It's a long-awaited major offensive from the government forces and the regional forces in support of Abiy Ahmed against the Tigrayan defense forces. This offensive had been in the waiting. Abiy Ahmed was inaugurated Monday this week, and it's kind of his inauguration offensive, as he has promised his followers. It is a major build-up of forces over the last days and weeks we have seen, and it started on Thursday with the aerial bombardment of Tigrayan defensive positions in the Amhara region and also closer to their old home region. And as we hear, the ground offensive will start at any time if it doesn't already started today.
The Prime Minister obviously thinks he can win. Is this an end game, do you think, in his mind?
I don't know what he's thinking. Yes, I do think he believes he may win the war, but this is just one battle in a long, long war to come. So if he's going to win this battle, if he's going to push back the TDF forces to their home turf, so to say, that's not even sure.
And why is he apparently so oblivious to international public opinion and to the warnings of the United Nations that there is a terrible humanitarian crisis being created here?
That's a good question. I think he is destined to prove that he is the new king of Ethiopia, as he calls himself. He is a prophecy, according to himself, to create a new Ethiopia, a strong Ethiopia, a united Ethiopia. And the obstacle to that is the Tigrayan leadership and the Tigrayan forces. So they have to be eliminated, in his view, in order to fulfill the aspirations he has for Ethiopia. And he has a backing of a core constituency in the country in this war. So it seems to be that he will not deviate from that objective, no matter the international pressure put upon him.
Eliminating the rebel forces. You can't see this government sitting with Tigrayan rebels at a negotiating table, can you not?
Not as the situation stands today, no. There is no signals that the Ethiopian government are interested in negotiating. The Tigrayan forces and the Tigrayan leadership have said they are interested in negotiations on certain preconditions are met. But from Abiy Ahmed's side, no, there is no sign yet for that to come. And as he say, we don't negotiate with terrorists.
What's been the scale of the killing so far?
There are different numbers floating around, some of them more empirical based than others, but anything from 50 to 200,000 maybe killed. It's very difficult to say.
Hundreds of thousands of people are also on the verge of starvation, and this is a situation that can no longer be monitored by UN officials because they've been kicked out, right?
Well, some of the senior staff has been kicked out, but there are UN officials left in Tigray. But yes, it is true, 400,000 are on the brink of starvation death as we speak. 5.2 million people in Tigray are depending upon humanitarian assistance, which they are not getting, because it is blocked by the Ethiopian government, according to UN. So it is a serious humanitarian crisis escalating as we speak.
That was Peace Studies Professor Kjetil Trunvoll in Norway. Now, a persistent economic crisis in Lebanon has long threatened widespread power cuts, and today, the whole country has lost electricity supply. How did it come to this? A question I put to Sibylle Risk. She is Director of Public Policies at the civil society organization Kuluna Irada in Lebanon and correspondent there for the French newspaper Le Figaro.
It's a mix of several things. First, there has been no investment in this sector for the past 15 years, so the demand is much higher than the capacity. Second, there is mismanagement, to say the least, between the tariffs and the costs of the electricity that caused a huge deficit in the public budget and contributed to the ballooning of the debt that eventually burst into a crisis 2 years ago. And third, there is the fact that we don't have as a country enough dollars to import the fuel to power these plants. And this is the latest reason why there's a blackout today in the public utility.
And what's nighttime in Beirut like with no electricity from the grid?
Beirut is still a better place than other regions in the country because it's relatively richer than other places. So you have private generators who provide electricity to buildings. In other places in the country, it's more difficult because this blackout has exception to that. I might stay here because I earn my living here, but I'm not sure my children will stay here.
What are people saying about the crisis? Is this power cut the last straw for some?
There is something incredible about the resilience of the Lebanese people, accepting very, very dire conditions of living. The basic needs are not there anymore. It's not only about electricity; it's also about accessing food and healthcare and medicine and milk for babies. So it has become very, very difficult for Lebanese to live in the country. And we are witnessing tens of thousands of Lebanese are fleeing the country because they cannot take it anymore.
That was Sibylle Risk reporting from Beirut. The English National Opera is providing another sign that culture is re-emerging post-pandemic. Next week, it's resuming performances in front of live audiences at its home, which is the London Coliseum. The first opera to be performed will be Philip Glass's Satyagraha, which is based around Mahatma Gandhi's early years in South Africa and his concept of non-violent protest before he returned home to lead a successful campaign for Indian independence from British rule. The opera is performed in Sanskrit, which is the root of many modern Indian languages, and directed by Phelim McDermott. He's been speaking to the BBC's Martin Bernard.
It's actually an opera about a concept and an idea that Gandhi created in his early years in South Africa, initially as a young lawyer, and it's meditations on moments. So one of the questions that comes up, the libretto is in ancient Sanskrit, so how am I going to follow along? The answer is, on some level, you don't need to follow along. It doesn't do any harm to know some of the historical things, but this opera is more about the formation of those ideas and the exploration of what those ideas are musically, rather than a narrative biography opera story. Satyagraha is a word that didn't exist before Gandhi invented it. He was looking for a word that described what their particular form of social activism and protest was. He didn't like the translation of, non-violence. He preferred what it truly meant, which was truth force. So it's about a particular way of protesting, of trying to make social change happen with a particular set of attitudes. And it involves basically self-examination. Some aspects of it are spiritual.